My dad called my startup a joke at Thanksgiving, then his bank called asking about my company. There were 11 people on the video call and I was the only one not wearing a tie. I sat in my kitchen in a gray hoodie, laptop propped on a stack of cookbooks, coffee going cold next to my elbow, and I watched the Bracton Trust Bank Executive Committee try to figure out how to address me. "Ms. Calloway," the chairman said, clearing his throat for the second time in 30 seconds, "before we proceed, I want to confirm something for the record. Lindenwood Capital is the lead entity on this acquisition bid?" "That's correct," I said. "And you are," he glanced down at a printed page like it might say something different this time, "the controlling principal." "I am." Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. Somewhere on that call, muted but visible, was a small square with my father's face in it. Hollis Calloway, Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending, Bracton Trust Bank, 31 years. I watched him realize in real time on a Tuesday afternoon in March exactly whose signature was about to be on the documents that would decide whether his branch survived the quarter. He hadn't said a word since the call started. He didn't say one for the rest of it either. 3 years earlier, at his dining room table in front of my mother, my brother, and an aunt who'd had 2 glasses of wine and opinions to match, my father had laughed, head back like I'd told a joke at my own expense, and said, "A spreadsheet with a logo. That's adorable, Marin. Let's see how long that lasts." He didn't know I was recording that dinner for a podcast pitch I never sent. He didn't know I'd kept the clip. He didn't know that 11 months later, the company he'd called a joke would be the one his own bank's risk department quietly recommended as a vendor. He definitely didn't know that the woman on the other end of a $37 million restructuring call was the same daughter he'd told, more than once, that she should get something stable before it was too late. I want to tell you how we got from that dinner table to that boardroom, because it didn't happen the way revenge stories usually go. There was no single moment where I stood up and said something cutting. There was no speech. What there was 4 years of 2 completely different lives running in parallel. His version of where I'd end up and the one I was actually building quietly while he wasn't looking. Before I get into it, I want to ask you something. Before I tell you how all of this happened, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Stories like this travel in a strange way. I've heard from people in towns I'd never even heard of, all saying some version of the same thing happened to them. So if you've got a second, drop where you're watching from in the comments. It helps me know who's actually out there. Now, let's go back to the beginning. I grew up in a house where dinner started at 6:15 and nobody sat down until my father had washed his hands, even if he hadn't touched anything dirty all day. It was a ritual more than a hygiene habit. It meant, the day is over, the bank is closed, now we are a family. My father worked at the same bank for his entire adult life. Not the same job. He climbed slowly and deliberately from teller to loan officer to vice president over 20-some years, but the same building, the same parking spot eventually, the same framed certificate of employee recognition hung in the same hallway by the coat closet. He believed, with the kind of conviction that doesn't bend for evidence, that there were 2 types of people in the world, people with a stable paycheck and people who would eventually need one. My mother, Diane, was the buffer. She ran a tight, warm household and had an instinct for de-escalating my father before his opinions turned into lectures. She loved both her children fiercely and unevenly, in the way that happens in families without anyone quite admitting it. My older brother, Trent, was the proof of concept for my father's worldview. He went to the state school 40 minutes from home, studied finance because Dad suggested it, and got hired at a regional insurance firm 2 months before graduation through a connection of my father's old golf buddy. He bought a starter home at 26 with a down payment my parents called a loan and never mentioned again. He was steady, likable, uncomplicated, and my father introduced him to people as my son. He's in finance the way other men introduce their kids as doctors. I was different in ways that took me a long time to stop apologizing for. I liked taking things apart to understand how they worked, the toaster, the lawnmower, eventually code. I asked questions that didn't have tidy answers. In 6th grade, I built a spreadsheet to track the school's recycling program because I thought the janitor's manual tally sheet was inefficient, and my teacher submitted it to a regional competition. My father's comment when I showed him the ribbon was, "That's nice. Did you finish your homework first?" It wasn't cruelty. I want to be fair about that because the story gets harder to tell honestly if I make him into a cartoon. It was something quieter and, in its way, more permanent, a complete inability to see ambition that didn't look like his own as anything other than a phase to be tolerated. By the time I got to college, I had 2 majors, 1 minor, and a part-time job building websites for local businesses that paid better than the part-time job I was supposed to have. I changed my major from finance, the one my father had picked out for me the way he'd picked it out for Trent, to computer science in my sophomore year. I told my parents over the phone. My mother asked if I was sure. My father asked flatly, "And what does a computer science degree pay exactly?" Not because he wanted the number, but because he wanted me to hear myself say a smaller one than Trent's. I didn't have a smaller number. I just didn't tell him that yet. What I had instead was an idea I'd been chewing on since my sophomore internship at a tiny community bank that still processed half its loan paperwork by hand. I'd watched loan officers, people exactly like my father, people who'd spent decades doing this, spend hours re-entering the same borrower data into 3 different systems because none of them talked to each other. I thought, this is insane. Someone should fix this. I decided that someone might as well be me. Here's the thing about building something in secret. It doesn't feel like secrecy at first. It feels like privacy. There's a difference, and I didn't understand that difference until I was already deep into it. By the time of that Thanksgiving call, the one with the 11 executives and my muted, frozen father, I had been running Lindenwood Capital for 14 months. Lindenwood wasn't the startup my father had mocked. Lindenwood was what came after it. Ledgerly, the original company, the spreadsheet with a logo, had started exactly as small as he assumed it would. 1 laptop, 1 client, a community bank in Ohio willing to let a 22-year-old rebuild their loan servicing backend for the price of a good reference. I lived on ramen and the kind of confidence that only makes sense in hindsight. I built Ledgerly into software that 31 regional banks used to track loan compliance, covenant breaches, and servicing schedules. Boring, invisible infrastructure that nobody thinks about until it breaks, which is exactly the kind of business that makes real money without making headlines. 3 years in, an investment group approached me not to buy Ledgerly outright but to fold its data and its client relationships into something bigger, a fund that specialized in acquiring distressed commercial loan portfolios from regional banks that had overextended themselves during the cheap money years. They needed someone who understood loan servicing at the granular level most acquirers never bother to learn. I understood it better than almost anyone in the room because I'd built the software that tracked it. That's how Lindenwood Capital came to exist, with me as the controlling principal, on the strength of a piece of software my own father had once watched me demo on a laptop at his kitchen table and said, without looking up from his newspaper, "I don't know who's going to pay for that." People did pay for it. Regularly. On schedule. In a way that, ironically, my father's own employer would eventually come to depend on. I want to be honest about something. I didn't build Lindenwood to get back at him. I built it because the problem was real and the math worked, and I was good at the part of the job that involved staring at loan covenant data until patterns showed up. The revenge part, if you can even call it that, was never the plan. It was just what happened to be sitting at the intersection of the bank my father works for took on too much commercial real estate risk in 2021 and 2022, and the firm best positioned to clean it up happens to be run by his daughter. Sometimes life doesn't need you to plan the irony. It just hands it to you. But that came later. Before I get to the part where the 2 timelines actually meet, the version of my life my father believed in and the one I was quietly building, I need to take you back to the year everything between us actually broke. If someone in your family has ever decided who you were going to be before you got the chance to show them, I'd genuinely love to know how you handled it in the comments. Some of you push back loudly. Some of you, like me, just go quiet and start building something they can't argue with later. Either way works. Now, here's where it actually started to break. I was 23 when I asked my father to co-sign a small business loan. I want to be precise about what I was asking for because it matters later. I wasn't asking for money. I had already saved enough from freelance contracts to cover the first 6 months of operating costs for Ledgerly. What I needed was a cosigner on a $40,000 line of credit from a local bank, not even his bank, a different one, to cover the gap between client invoices and payroll while the business found its footing. My credit history was thin, the way it is for everyone at 23. Cosigner with a long, clean financial record would have made the loan officer's decision trivial. My father was, by profession, exactly the kind of person banks trust to cosign things. That was the bitter joke of it. I drove home on a Sunday with a folder of projections, client letters of intent, and a one-page summary I'd rewritten 4 times to make it sound less like hope and more like a plan. I sat across from him at the same table where he washed his hands before dinner every night of my childhood, and I walked him through it. He listened. I'll give him that. He actually listened, didn't interrupt, let me finish the whole pitch. Then he leaned back and said, "Marin, I've spent 30 years looking at numbers like this. You know what I see in front of me? Kid with no revenue history asking me to put my name on a loan for a business that fixes paperwork. Banks don't take that seriously. I'm not going to put my name on something I wouldn't approve at my own desk." "You haven't even looked at the client letters," I said. "I don't need to. I know what a real loan application looks like, and I know what this is." He tapped the folder, not unkindly, the way you'd correct a child's math homework. "This is a hobby with a business plan stapled to it." My mother tried to soften it. "Maybe just look it over again, Hollis." But he'd already made his decision the way he made every decision, fast and final, and the conversation was over before I'd finished asking the second question I'd prepared. I got the loan anyway, eventually 6 weeks later, from a small business lender that specialized in exactly the kind of thin-file risk my father refused to touch. The interest rate was worse than it would have been with a cosigner, almost 4 points worse, which on a $40,000 line of credit over 3 years is not a small amount of money when you're paying yourself less than minimum wage to keep the lights on. I remember doing the math on a legal pad at my kitchen table, the actual dollar figure that decision was going to cost me over the life of the loan, and feeling something harden in my chest that hadn't been there before. I didn't tell my father about the loan I eventually got. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of being asked again, and I didn't want to hear what he might say about the interest rate because some part of me knew exactly what he'd say, that it proved his point that a real bank wouldn't have touched it either. He never asked. In 30 years of being a loan officer, my father somehow never developed the habit of following up on the people he'd already decided not to help. It wasn't the money in the end. It was the sentence, "I know what a real loan application looks like, and I know what this is," said by a man who'd never once asked to see my actual numbers. At Thanksgiving that year, my Aunt Pam, my father's sister, sharp-tongued and well-meaning in the way that aunts often are, asked how the computer thing was going. I said it was going well, that I'd just signed my 3rd client. My father, without looking up from carving the turkey, said, "She's calling it a company." I keep telling her, get something with benefits first, build the hobby on the side. Everyone laughed. Not cruelly, that's the part that's hard to explain to people who weren't there. It was the easy, warm laugh of a family that has decided, collectively and without malice, who one of its members is going to be. Nobody at that table thought they were doing anything wrong. That's usually how it works. I laughed too. I want you to know that. I laughed along with everyone else, passed the cranberry sauce, and went back to my apartment that night and opened my laptop and worked until 2 in the morning because the alternative was sitting with how that sentence had felt. Here's something I didn't tell my family for almost 2 years. Bracton Trust Bank was on a list. Not a public list, nothing dramatic, no headlines. It was an internal watch list that Lindenwood's research team maintained on regional banks with concentrated exposure to commercial real estate loans originated between 2020 and 2022, the kind of loans that look fine on paper until interest rates move and refinancing gets expensive. Bracton showed up on that list the same quarter I noticed my father had started talking very specifically about some restructuring at the branch without elaborating. I didn't connect it immediately. Bracton Trust has 11 branches across 2 states. My father managed commercial lending at one of them. It wasn't until our analyst, a sharp 26-year-old named Priya who had no idea about my family situation, pulled up the loan officer attribution data on one of Bracton's larger distressed accounts and said, almost as a throwaway comment, this one's got a Callaway on it as the originating officer. A relative of yours, that I understood exactly how small the world had decided to get. I told her it was a common enough name. It is not a common enough name. What I found once I actually looked, and I want to be careful here because looking felt like crossing a line even though it was professionally exactly my job, was that my father had personally approved 3 commercial loans in 2021 that were now significantly underwater. Not fraud. Not negligence in any way a regulator would care about. Just bad timing, bad luck, the kind of mistake that happens to careful, competent people when the economic floor shifts under everyone at once. He'd done what every loan officer in the country was doing that year. He'd just done it at a bank that, as a whole, had done too much of it. I sat with that information for 3 weeks before I told anyone at Lindenwood that I had a personal connection to the target. I want to be honest about why I waited. It wasn't strategy. It was that I genuinely didn't know what to do with the feeling of holding information that could matter to my father's career inside a deal he had no idea I was anywhere near. Then my phone rang. It was my mother, not my father. He never called me directly about anything that mattered, that had always been her job, and she said in the careful voice she used when she didn't want to alarm me, "Your dad's job might be in some trouble. The bank's going through some kind of review. He hasn't said much, but he's not sleeping." I asked what kind of review. "I don't really understand the details," she said. "Something about the loans they made a few years back. He keeps saying it's not his fault, the market did this, not him. I believe him. I worry." I told her I was sure it would be fine. I hung up the phone and sat in my office, the one with my name on the lease, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a strange, heavy quiet. The man who told me I didn't understand what a real loan application looked like was now on the wrong side of one, and I was professionally one of the people whose job it was to evaluate exactly that kind of failure. I called Priya back in and told her, for the first time, the truth. "I need you to know something before this goes further. The loan officer on those accounts is my father." She didn't say anything for a second. Then, "Do you want to recuse yourself?" I thought about it longer than I expected to. Let me go back further, because the loan rejection wasn't the only thing that happened in those years, and if I only tell you about the money, you'll miss the part that actually mattered more. The year after the loan, Trent got engaged. The engagement party was at my parents' house, white string lights in the backyard, my mother's good dishes out for the first time since Christmas. I came alone. I'd been seeing someone, but the relationship hadn't survived the 80-hour weeks I was putting into Ledgerly, and I hadn't told anyone that part yet either. My father gave a toast. He talked about Trent's steady rise at the insurance firm, his promotion to senior underwriter, a young man who understands that real success is built slow, one responsible decision at a time. Everyone raised their glasses. I raised mine too. Then he added, almost as an aside, looking around the yard for a laugh, not like some of us running off chasing app ideas, and nodded in my direction, and the yard laughed, and I smiled because what else do you do at your brother's engagement party? That was the year the gaslighting started, though I didn't have that word for it yet. It wasn't dramatic. It was small and constant, the kind that's almost impossible to point to as any one specific offense. When I mentioned closing a new client, my father would ask if I'd found something more permanent yet. When I mentioned hiring my first employee, he asked if I was sure that was wise with how unstable things are. When Ledgerly hit its first profitable quarter, actually profitable, not just revenue, real margin, I told him at Sunday dinner and he said, that's good, in the tone you use for a child's finger painting, and then asked Trent about his new house's gutter situation for the next 20 minutes. I started noticing a pattern I couldn't unsee once I saw it. Every piece of good news I brought to that table got acknowledged in exactly 4 words or less, and every piece of Trent's news got a follow-up question. I wasn't being paranoid. I started, almost unconsciously, timing it. Public humiliation came at my cousin's wedding, 18 months before the Thanksgiving call. There was an open mic moment at the reception. toasts from anyone who wanted to give one, and my uncle, half joking, asked me to say something since I was the entrepreneur of the family now. I stood up, said something short and warm about the couple, sat back down. My father, 2 seats away, leaned toward the uncle next to him and said, just loud enough for the table to hear, she's been an entrepreneur for 4 years. Still waiting on the entrepreneur part where it actually pays for itself. Gotta laugh. It always gotta laugh. That was the part that took me the longest to forgive, not the comment itself but how reliably it worked on a room. I want to tell you I had a clean comeback in that moment. I didn't. I smiled and I excused myself to the restroom, and I sat in a stall at my cousin's wedding and let myself cry for exactly 90 seconds before I fixed my makeup and went back out and danced with my mother to a song I don't remember because that's what you do. What I did instead of arguing was something my father, ironically, had taught me without meaning to. I went back to the numbers. Every comment he made I turned into fuel for a spreadsheet only I could see. Every still waiting for it to pay for itself got answered eventually in a column he'd never read because I never showed him. That was the choice I made somewhere in that bathroom stall. I stopped trying to convince him with words. I decided I would only ever show him results, and only when I was ready and only on my terms. I didn't know yet what on my terms would actually end up looking like. The worst Thanksgiving came 2 years before the bank call, the year Ledgerly closed its Series A. I want you to understand what that meant professionally before I tell you what happened at that table. A Series A isn't just money. It's validation from people whose entire job is finding reasons to say no. I had spent 6 months in due diligence, answering questions designed to break my story if there was any crack in it, and the round closed clean. Real investors, a real board seat for our lead, real money in the account. I drove home for Thanksgiving that year planning for the first time to actually tell my family something true and good and let it land the way it deserved to. I waited until dessert, the way you wait for the right moment in a room that's never given you one before. I said, I wanted to share some news. Ledgerly closed our series of funding round this week. It's a real milestone for the company. My mother said, oh, Marin, that's wonderful, and meant it and reached over and squeezed my hand. My father set down his fork. How much? I told him the number. It was, by any reasonable measure, a significant number for a company 3 years old. He was quiet for a second and then he laughed. The same laugh from years before, head back easy like I'd told a good joke at my own expense. A spreadsheet with a logo, he said to the table, not to me. That's adorable, Marin. Let's see how long that lasts. You know, most of these things burn through the money and fold in 2 years. I've seen it happen at the bank a dozen times. Companies raise a big number, everyone gets excited, then it's gone and there's nothing to show for it. This isn't like that, I said. We have actual revenue. Actual clients. The funding is to scale what's already working. Sure, he said, in the voice you use to end a conversation you've already decided the outcome of. Sure, Marin. That was the moment. Not the loan rejection, not the wedding comment, not the engagement party toast. That was the one I kept replaying for months afterward because of one specific detail. I had the recorder running on my phone in my coat pocket. I'd been preparing a pitch for a fintech podcast that wanted a founder story episode, and I'd been recording bits of my life that week for material, an idea I abandoned almost immediately afterward because it felt invasive even toward myself. But that night, I forgot to turn it off before dinner. I didn't listen back to it for almost a year. When I finally did, alone in my apartment on a Tuesday night for no reason I could explain except that I needed to hear it once clearly outside the fog of actually being at that table, I heard exactly how casual it was. How easy the laugh came. How certain he sounded that he was right, and how little space there was in his voice for the possibility that he wasn't. I didn't save it because I planned to use it. I saved it because some part of me needed proof later that I hadn't imagined how that had felt. If you've ever sat at a table where the people who were supposed to believe in you laughed at the thing you were proudest of, go ahead and drop a like before we keep going. What happened over the next year reminded me that the people who doubt you the loudest are often the ones with the least information. I didn't recuse myself. I want to explain why because it's the part of this story I'm least certain I got right even now. Priya asked the right question. Do you want to recuse yourself? And the honest answer was that recusing myself wouldn't have protected my father from anything. The deal was going to happen with or without my involvement. Bracton's exposure was real, the watch list wasn't personal, and some acquiring fund was going to come in and evaluate those underwater loans whether I was in the room or not. The only thing my involvement changed was whether the process was handled by someone who understood, in granular human terms, exactly what was at stake for the people on the other side of those loan files. So I stayed on the deal. But I did it carefully, and I did it on the record, which matters. I told our compliance officer in writing about the family relationship. I asked for an internal ethics review before I touched a single document related to my father's specific accounts. I was walled off, formally with documentation, from any analysis touching his 3 loans specifically, even though I had full visibility into the broader Bracton portfolio. Every step I took with a paper trail because some instinct in me knew that if this story ever got told, even just inside my own head, even just to myself at 2 in the morning, I needed to know I hadn't used my position to settle something personal. What I did do on my own time was prepare. I pulled together, slowly and quietly, every piece of documentation that would matter if this ever came to a confrontation that wasn't strictly professional. The recording from the Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier. Screenshots of text messages from my mother describing my father's stress. A timeline I built almost compulsively of every comment, every dismissal, every laugh that had landed at my expense at a family table, dated and organized the way I organize everything because that's the only language I trust completely. I want to be clear, I never planned to play any of this for my family. I wasn't building a case to present at a dinner table like a prosecutor. I was building something else, a private, complete record of the truth for myself because for years I had started to doubt my own memory of how dismissive things had actually been. Gaslighting works partly by making you unsure whether you're overreacting. Having dates and recordings and screenshots wasn't ammunition. It was a way of trusting myself again. 3 weeks before the executive call, our team finalized the bid structure for Bracton's distressed portfolio. I sat in on every meeting except the ones involving my father's specific accounts, which were handled entirely by Priya and reviewed independently by our compliance officer. I signed nothing that touched his loans directly. I signed everything else. The night before the bid went in, I called my mother, the way I did most Sundays, and asked carefully how my father was doing. "He's quieter than usual," she said. "There's some big meeting with potential buyers coming up. He keeps saying he hopes whoever it is understands the loans weren't his fault, that anyone would have approved them at the time." "I'm sure they'll be fair," I told her, and I meant it, and I hated a little how much I meant it. I hung up and looked at the bid documents on my screen, Lindenwood Capital Controlling Principal, Marin Calloway, and thought about a man at a Thanksgiving table 2 years earlier laughing, saying, "Let's see how long that lasts." It had lasted long enough to end up here. The bid went in on a Thursday. Bracton's board reviewed 3 competing offers from different acquisition groups over the following 10 days, and Lindenwood's was, by every metric that actually mattered to a board under regulatory pressure, the strongest one. We weren't the highest dollar figure. One competitor offered slightly more for the portfolio. But we were the most credible on execution because Ledgerly's existing software was already integrated into Bracton's loan servicing systems on the compliance side. A relationship that predated the acquisition talks entirely and had nothing to do with my family connection. Bracton's own risk department had recommended Ledgerly's compliance tools 2 years earlier, before anyone on that side of the business had any idea who owned the company providing them. That detail mattered more than almost anything else in this story, and I want to slow down on it. My father's employer had already chosen to trust my work as a vendor on its own merits before any of this got personal. Nobody handed Lindenwood the deal because of who my father was. If anything, the family connection was a complication the deal teams had to formally manage around, not an advantage anyone extended to me. I think that detail is the actual turning point of this whole story, more than any single confrontation. Somewhere in a risk department meeting I wasn't even in the room for 2 years before any of this, A group of strangers who had never met me looked at what I'd built and decided it was good enough to trust with their own bank's compliance data. That decision, made entirely without sentiment, without family, without anyone in that room knowing my last name meant anything to them, was the actual proof I'd spent years wanting. Not a number. Not a headline. Just a room full of professionals choosing my work because it was good. Everything after that was just the universe arranging itself around a decision that had already been made on its own merits. 10 days after the bid went in, Bracton's board accepted Lindenwood's offer, pending a final executive call to walk through transition logistics with the affected branch leadership, including the senior commercial lending team at the branch responsible for the distressed accounts. My father's branch. My father's accounts, technically excluded from my direct involvement but absolutely part of the broader restructuring conversation he was about to sit through. I asked our compliance officer one more time whether I should be on that call at all, given the personal stakes. "You're the controlling principal of the acquiring entity," she said. "You're supposed to be on that call. That's not a conflict. Conflict would be hiding it." I thought about every time my father had told me in one form or another that I didn't understand what real responsibility looked like. "Okay," I said. "I'll be on it." The call was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday. 11 names on the invite. Bracton's chairman, 2 board members, their general counsel, their chief risk officer, 3 branch-level executives including my father, and 3 people from Lindenwood, me, Priya, and our deal counsel. I didn't tell my parents I'd be on that call. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy and it wasn't a setup. I genuinely didn't know, until about an hour before, whether my father even knew the acquiring entity's name. Bank restructurings move through layers of formality before individual branch executives get the full picture, and there was a real chance he'd find out the same way everyone else on his side of the table would, by reading it off a slide. I sat at my kitchen table that morning and thought about putting on a blazer. I decided against it. Not as a statement, I genuinely just didn't think it mattered anymore whether I looked the part. I'd spent years trying to look like someone my father would take seriously. I wasn't interested in doing that one more time for an audience that, as it turned out, included him only by coincidence of seating. I logged in 4 minutes early. Most of the Bracton side was already on, faces arranged in the small grid the way executive calls always look. Serious, a little tired, the particular blankness of people about to discuss bad news professionally. I saw my father's square appear at 1:58. He was in his work shirt, the blue one with the bank's small embroidered logo on the collar that I'd seen in 100 photos over the years. He glanced at the participant list the way everyone does at the start of a call, scanning names. I watched his face when he got to mine. It didn't change immediately. That's the part nobody tells you about moments like this. They don't land the way they do in movies all at once. His expression just sort of paused the way of video buffers, and then he looked, very deliberately, away from his own camera like he needed a second before his face did something he hadn't authorized. The chairman opened the call with standard formalities, thanking everyone for their time, summarizing the purpose of the discussion, confirming that today's session would walk through the transition framework for the accepted bid. Then he said the sentence that I think my father had genuinely not absorbed until that exact moment, even though it had been in 3 separate documents he'd presumably seen. "Before we proceed, I want to confirm something for the record. Lindenwood Capital is the lead entity on this acquisition bid, with Ms. Calloway as the controlling principal, correct?" "That's correct," I said. 11 faces. Most of them neutral, professional, unbothered. To everyone except one person on that call, I was simply the counterparty, a name on a document, nothing more dramatic than that. Deals like this happen every week in this industry. Nobody else in that room had any reason to feel anything at all. But I watched my father's square in the grid, small and silent, and I watched him understand in real time that the daughter he had spent years describing as a hobbyist with a business plan stapled to her ambitions was now sitting on the other side of the table that would decide the terms under which his branch survived the next 2 years. He didn't unmute. Not once for the rest of that call. I don't know if it was shock or shame or some calculation about professionalism that told him silence was the safest move available. I'll never fully know because we have never to this day talked about that specific hour directly. What I do know is that somewhere in the next 90 minutes, while our deal counsel walked through transition timelines and the chief risk officer asked detailed questions about loan covenant restructuring, I watched a man who had spent 30 years being the most confident person in every room he entered become, for the first time in my entire life, completely quiet in one. If you've made it this far, you already know the next part is where everything actually gets revealed. Not in some big dramatic speech, but in the quiet, specific details that come out once the documents are actually on the table. If you want to see exactly how this unfolded, consider subscribing because what comes next is the part people always ask me to retell. The reveal in this story didn't happen the way I expected reveals to happen, back when I used to imagine confronting my father someday. There was no single dramatic sentence. Came out in 4 separate pieces spread across that call and the weeks after, each one landing a little differently than the last. Reveal 1 came halfway through the executive call when Bracton's chief risk officer pulled up a slide showing the 3 restructured loan accounts at the center of the portfolio's distress, and asked as a routine procedural question whether Lindenwood's team had any conflicts of interest to disclose regarding the loan officers attached to those specific files. Our compliance officer answered for us calmly, exactly as we'd prepared. Yes. For full transparency, Ms. Calloway has a familial relationship with the originating loan officer on these 3 accounts. She has been formally walled off from any analysis or decision-making touching these specific files, with documentation available for review. I watched my father square. He still hadn't unmuted, but his hand came up and touched his own collar, the small, unconscious gesture of a man checking whether his tie is straight when there is no tie. Bracton's chairman simply nodded and said, "Noted, thank you for the disclosure," and the meeting moved on because to everyone in that room except my father and me, it was a routine compliance footnote. The mundaneness of it was, in a strange way, the most powerful part. There was no scandal. There was no gasp. The world did not stop to acknowledge what this meant to the 2 of us. It just kept going the way the world generally does. Reveal 2 came 40 minutes later when our deal counsel walked through the vendor continuity plan for Bracton's loan servicing software, the systems that would remain in place through the transition, and named Ledgerly as the existing platform that would continue handling compliance tracking for the restructured accounts. For the committee's awareness, our counsel said, Ledgerly was selected and onboarded by Bracton's own risk department 2 years ago, independent of this transaction. Ms. Calloway founded that company. The continuity plan simply maintains the existing vendor relationship. This was the moment one of the board members, a woman I'd later learn had personally championed Ledgerly's onboarding 2 years earlier, said almost to herself but audible to everyone, "Oh, that's your company? We've been thrilled with that platform." I watched my father hear his own bank's board praise the thing he called a spreadsheet with a logo, completely unprompted, completely sincerely, with no idea of the history behind the sentence. Reveal 3 happened 3 days later, not on a call but in a phone conversation with my mother, who called me sounding shaken in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Your father told me everything," she said. "About the call. About Marin, why didn't you tell us what you'd built?" "Any of it?" I told her the truth, which surprised even me as I said it out loud for the first time. Because every time I tried for years, the response made it clear there wasn't room for it. I stopped trying to make space where there wasn't any. I just built somewhere else instead. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the thing I think she'd needed to say for longer than she probably realized. "He's not handling it well. He keeps saying he had no idea, like that's supposed to make it better, and I keep telling him, Hollis, you didn't have to have no idea. You could have just asked her." Reveal 4 came 2 weeks after that, in the only direct conversation my father and I had about any of it. Not a call, not a confrontation, just an unscheduled 15 minutes at my parents' kitchen table on a Sunday I'd come home for an unrelated reason. He didn't apologize, not exactly. What he did was harder for him in its own way. He sat down across from me, the way he had years earlier when I'd brought him the loan folder, and he said, "I looked up the deal terms your firm put forward. They were generous to the branch staff. More generous than the other bidders, from what I understand." He paused. I didn't think you'd be the type to be generous about it, given everything. I built the deal on the numbers, not on you, I told him. It just turned out the numbers and being fair to your staff weren't in conflict. They usually aren't if you actually look at them honestly. He nodded slowly, looking at his hands on the table instead of at me. I think, he said, I spent a long time assuming I knew what a real loan application looked like. I'm starting to think I should have asked more questions instead of assuming I already knew the answer. It wasn't an apology. It was the closest thing to one I'd ever gotten from him, and I decided sitting there that it was going to have to be enough. I want to push back gently on the word villain here because I don't think it's the right word for my father, and I think the story is more honest, and frankly more useful to anyone listening who's lived something similar, if I don't pretend otherwise. What actually happened to him in the weeks after that executive call wasn't collapse in the dramatic sense. Nobody fired him. Bracton's restructuring agreement, the one Lindenwood negotiated, didn't single out individual loan officers for the bank's broader risk decisions. That would have been both unfair and bad business, and I made sure from my walled-off position that the deal terms reflected that. My father kept his job. His branch stayed open, restructured but intact. What collapsed wasn't his career. It was a story he told himself and told everyone around him for years, that he understood risk, that he understood what real success looked like, that he could spot a fragile, hobbyist business from across a dinner table with nothing but instinct and 3 decades of experience. That story had been wrong, specifically and provably wrong, in a way that showed up on slides in front of his own board. I watched the version of him that came out of that period, and it was smaller in some ways and larger in others. He stopped almost entirely making comments about other people's career choices at family dinners, not just mine, anyone's. My cousin announced she was leaving a stable government job to become a potter, full-time, no safety net, and I watched my father, who 2 years earlier would have had something dry and dismissive ready before she'd even finished the sentence, just nod and ask her what kind of kiln she was looking at. He didn't say much about Ledgerly or Lindenwood even after everything came out. I think, in his own quiet way, he didn't fully know how to talk about a thing that had outgrown every category he'd had ready for it. At one family dinner, my Aunt Pam, the same aunt from the wedding years earlier, asked me in front of everyone what exactly my company did now, and before I could answer, my father said simply, "She runs something bigger than I understood." I'd let her explain it, she's better at it than I am. It wasn't a grand confession. It wasn't dramatic enough for a movie. But I'd spent years wanting one sentence from him that didn't have a joke folded into it, and that was the sentence, finally, sitting there plain on the table between the cranberry sauce and my mother's good dishes. I think the real collapse, if there was one, happened privately, somewhere I never saw directly, in whatever conversations he had with himself about 30 years of certainty meeting one Tuesday afternoon where the certainty didn't hold. I didn't get to witness that part, and honestly, I don't think I was entitled to. Some collapses are private, and forcing your way into watching someone else's isn't justice. It's just cruelty with better lighting. What I got instead was smaller, and I've come to think more valuable, a father who started asking questions before he delivered verdicts. Took 30-some years and one very specific Tuesday to get there. I'll take it. People ask me, when I tell this story, what I said to him in that final moment at the kitchen table. Like there must have been a line, something sharp and satisfying, the sentence I'd apparently been saving up since I was 23 years old with a lone folder he wouldn't open. There wasn't one. I want to be honest about that because I think the honest version is more useful than the satisfying one. What I actually said after he told me he should have asked more questions instead of assuming he knew the answers was, "I'm not interested in you feeling bad about this for the rest of your life. I just want you to actually ask going forward. With me and with anyone else in the family who tries to build something you don't immediately understand." He looked surprised by that. I think he expected something harsher given everything, and some part of me, the part that had sat in a bathroom stall at my cousin's wedding for 90 seconds, the part that had kept a phone recording for a year before listening to it once, understood why he'd expect that. I'd earned the right to a harsher sentence than the one I gave him. I didn't use it though, and here's why. The version of this story where I make him grovel, where I list every slight back to him in order with dates and recordings like evidence in a trial, isn't a story about justice. It's a story about turning the same weapon he used on me, certainty delivered as a verdict, designed to make someone smaller, and pointing it back at him. I'd spent years deciding I didn't want to be the kind of person who does that to people, even people who deserve it. Especially, maybe, people who deserve it. That's the version of strength I actually wanted, more than I wanted the satisfying sentence. I never played him the Thanksgiving recording. I still have it. I don't know if I'll ever use it for anything beyond what it already gave me, which was the simple, private confirmation that I hadn't imagined how that night felt. Some evidence you keep for yourself, not for the other person's trial. What I did instead, a few months later, was something smaller and, I think, more meaningful than any confrontation could have been. I invited my parents to Lindenwood's office for the first time. I gave my father an actual tour, not a performance, not a victory lap, just a normal Tuesday where he watched Priya walk him through how the loan servicing models actually worked, the same kind of work he'd spent 30 years doing manually, automated and scaled in a way he'd genuinely never seen done before. He asked questions the whole time. Real ones. The kind he should have asked at a dining room table years earlier, when a 23-year-old brought him a folder he never opened. At the end of the tour, standing by the window of an office with my name on the lease, he said quietly, almost to himself, "I had no idea this is what it actually looked like." Not the company's valuation. Not the deal with his own bank. Just the actual work. The thing I'd been trying to show him the whole time, in every version of that pitch I never got to finish. "I know," I told him. "That was sort of the problem." He nodded, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, neither of us needed the conversation to go anywhere else. It's been about 8 months since that Tuesday call. Bracton Trust completed the restructuring on schedule, and my father is still there, still managing commercial lending, though his department now runs partly on ledgerly software, which still makes me laugh in a way I haven't fully explained to him. He brings it up sometimes carefully, the way you bring up a subject you're still finding the right words for. Last month he asked, unprompted, whether Lindenwood was hiring analysts because a young loan officer at his branch, sharp, underestimated by everyone around her in ways my father recognized immediately, for reasons he didn't say out loud but that I understood completely, was thinking about leaving banking for something more entrepreneurial and didn't know where to start. He asked if I'd talked to her. I did. We had coffee. I told her some version of what I'm telling you now. That the people who doubt you loudest often just don't have the information yet, and that the only thing that ever actually changes their mind is finishing the thing, not arguing about it. My mother tells me my father has started reading about commercial lending technology on his own time, the way some people take up a hobby late in life, not because anyone asked him to, but because he says he wants to actually understand what's happening to the industry instead of guessing. I think that's the real ending of this story, the part that matters more than any boardroom reveal. Not the moment he found out who I was, but the slower, quieter decision afterward to actually find out what I do. We had Thanksgiving again this year. Same table, same good dishes, my mother's same recipe for cranberry sauce that nobody's ever been brave enough to suggest changing. When my Aunt Pam asked how the company was doing, my father answered before I could. "She runs one of the firms that ended up restructuring our distressed commercial portfolio," he said, with something in his voice that wasn't quite pride, not yet, but was at least finally accurate. "It's more complicated than I used to give her credit for." It wasn't the speech I used to imagine back when I imagined speeches. It was 4 sentences at a dinner table, delivered without a laugh folded into them for the first time in longer than I could remember. That was enough. Turns out that's usually what it actually takes. Not a courtroom moment, not a single cutting line you've been saving for years, just one ordinary dinner where someone finally tells the truth instead of the joke. I think about that Thanksgiving table a lot, the one where he laughed and the one years later where he didn't. I don't know if revenge is even the right word for what happened in between. Felt more like 2 timelines running side by side without either of us realizing it, until one Tuesday afternoon they finally crossed. I want to ask you something before you go. If you were in my position, sitting on that call, watching someone who doubted you for years realize exactly what you'd built, would you have said something? Or would you have done what I did, and let the silence say it for you? And for those of you who've lived some version of this, being underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best, was there a single moment it actually turned around for you? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.